Hi, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're at. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us for this presentation on medical device cybersecurity. My name is John Gomez. I'm the CEO and founder of Sensato. And we have some people still joining us, so we'll take it slow at first and then kind of accelerate as we go through the content. So just want to talk a little bit about us, and then we'll get into the content. This is a pretty deep training series. You're not going to get a lot of marketing or sales pitches. We're really going to get into kind of the meat and potatoes of medical device cybersecurity. But just in the event that there is a way for us to hopefully work with you, there are a variety of different things we do as Sensato. We do provide risk assessments, NIST 853, NIST CSF, HIPAA, C2M2, and maturity modeling. We do have a virtual CISO program. We have a program specific to critical access in rural hospitals as well as community hospitals and larger. We do a tremendous amount of penetration testing and tabletop simulations. So that's part of what we do. There's a bunch more that we do that I'll talk to you about towards the end. I also want to kind of highlight our experience and background in medical device security. I think this is important in order to hopefully frame the content that we're going to be presenting to you and where and how have we formed our opinions. We started doing medical device security assessments for hospitals here in the US, specifically around 2015, and there was a tremendous amount that we learned in doing that. That and also attending an FDA workshop in the 2015 to 16 timeframe led us to start something that was known as the Medical Device Cybersecurity Task Force, or MDCTF. The Medical Device Cybersecurity Task Force was composed of, I believe at its height, somewhere in the area of 80 different hospitals, consultancies, and other groups that came together to really talk about what needs to get done for medical device security. So we were fortunate enough to be one of the founders and leaders of that group. We learned a tremendous amount related to the challenges that hospitals have in terms of trying to deploy medical device security programs. You'll hear some of that today. In 2017, the FDA approached us and asked if we could convert the MDCTF into an ISAO. So we did. We still are an ISAO today, an information sharing and analysis organization. I'll talk a little more about that briefly. And then we kind of continued to evolve. And I'll talk more about some of the things we've done related to kind of, I guess, establishing ourselves in medical device cybersecurity over the years. And again, I mention this mostly just to give you context as to where we're forming our opinions and our guidance that we hopefully will provide you throughout this series. We have some amazing partners. We are the official cybersecurity partner for the Greater New York Hospital Association, the North Carolina Hospital Association, New Jersey Hospital Association, Washington State, and also, although it's not on the side, the National Rural Health Hospital Association. So we've tried very hard to deliver on our focus of being a healthcare-specific cybersecurity firm. We were established in 2013, and we're headquartered out of New Jersey, though we have presence throughout the United States. As I mentioned, we are an ISAO. I'm assuming most of you know what an ISAO is. We're a little bit different in terms of the way we look at or the way that we're chartered as an ISAO, I should say. We are chartered to be a cross-sector ISAO, so we really do monitor all 16 critical infrastructure sectors. The reason we do that is we can learn a lot from some of the adjacent sectors. We bring that back into the work we do in the healthcare sector, and that sometimes helps us in terms of predicting threats related to specifically hospitals and the healthcare industry. So that's kind of the background there. The second piece of this is we do have a memorandum of understanding with the FDA, and in that context, we at times are called upon by the FDA to provide guidance, suggestions, feedback on threats related to medical devices here in the US. There's a variety of different roles we play in that. Typically, it's a tactical role where we're trying to think about what the guidance should be in the first 24 to 72 hours of an issue or an incident. We also interface at times with the cybersecurity researchers who have discovered an exploit, or if there are attackers involved, we can interface with them. We have developed proof of concepts for what have been known exploits against medical devices to assure that these things are actually exploitable. And at times we've presented to the sector with FDA in terms of what we've learned and the guidance and suggestions we would give to hospitals. So all of those things going back to 2015 are kind of what have brought us to today. And the information we're going to share with you, not only on this presentation, but the next two presentations that we hope you'll attend and get value from. We also operate what's known as the Sensado Cybersecurity Tactical Operations Center. This is a CTOC, is the short name for it. This is a 24/7 monitoring center. It's part fusion center, part SOC, part a few other things. The key thing that differentiates the CTOC is that it does have specific protocols and processes and methodologies to respond to cybersecurity incidents that involve human life. And we'll share a lot of that with you probably in the third session that we do on how we do that and the considerations. We'll touch on some of it today a little bit, but ultimately a lot of things that we've learned in terms of how do you respond to an actual incident that involves human life when it's precipitated by a cyber attack comes from our work day to day in the CTOC. So for those of you that may be new to us and haven't interacted with us before, either individually or as an organization, one of the things to know about us is we are very different. We are not the typical cybersecurity firm. We continually admit that we are not for everybody. We try to differentiate ourselves in a few different ways. And so I start this presentation giving you that disclaimer and warning just because there are things that we will bring up in this presentation that are not status quo and they're not the traditional approach to cybersecurity. We don't believe those things actually work. And we will try to provide you evidence of those things as we bring them up. We just don't want anybody to kind of sit there and go, where are these guys coming from? We are purposely tried to be different. We think different is a critical success factor when you're defending human life. The other thing we will tell you, or I'll tell you, is please right size this for you. We, first of all, don't know it all. We're always open to learning and evolving what we understand. But we also understand that the things that we will share with you in these presentations may not fit your organization, either because of the resources, the culture, your approach to cybersecurity, economics, a variety of different things. So what we're doing here is trying to provide you with as much information and then allowing you to right size this as makes sense for you. And in some cases, maybe none of it makes sense, but hopefully at least it starts getting you to think, and maybe we can save you a lot of effort going down a path that doesn't make sense for you, and you have a different path that you need to follow. So with that, we're going to kind of jump into this program, give you a little bit of context as to why we brought this together and what was the impetus to make this happen. We've seen that since 2015, there is a big gap in terms of guidance, collectively or individually, in terms of how do you bring together a best practice-based medical device security program. We hear this a lot from our clients. We hear this a lot from our partners. We hear this a lot just colloquially when we attend events in terms of, what are we supposed to do and how do we know we're doing it right, and what are the best practices, and is there a framework, and is there a methodology? And so we thought, this is something that maybe it's time we broadly share what we do. And we invite you and encourage you to share what you learn in these presentations with as many people as you can. And hopefully as a community, we can evolve and close some of the gaps that may exist. We understand that there's also minimal best practices, or I think the belief is that there are minimal best practices. A lot of best practices actually are out there, but I don't think they're collected in any one place. And then lastly, there is a missing regulatory foundation. And we'll touch on that as we go through this, but shortly stated, or stated simply, I suppose, is there is no one regulatory framework for how do you deploy a medical device security program in a hospital. And the context of this presentation is really from the perspective of a hospital. I think this has application, though, for medical device manufacturers who are trying to differentiate themselves and want to make life easier for hospitals by embedding security best practices in the deployment, management, and design of their systems. And we do work with medical device manufacturers, so we do understand the challenges posed there. And so it's not that we're making an excuse for anybody, but we do think that the more medical device manufacturers can understand the challenges faced by hospitals day to day, the better everybody comes out on the other end. But this concept that, or this piece here, that there is a missing regulatory foundation in our ecosystem, we think is also a concern and a reason to get a gathering like this together. What we hope you'll do, the objectives of the program, is that you kind of do some just-in-time auditing. I think it's great to attend, things like this and get to see all the cool PowerPoints and things. But ultimately, if you're auditing your own program as you go, that's probably a great value or return on investment in the time you're putting into this. Ask yourself, are we doing this or are we not? Or, we really need to go do that. I think it gives you kind of almost a mini risk assessment, if you will, of what you've deployed. You may find that everything we talk about here, you're already doing, or you may find you're not, and then you have work to do. Hopefully it evolves the skill set as a community, that all of us kind of can work to get our skills in protecting medical devices up to the next level. And then obviously we're looking to create professional awareness. For us, the big thing here, whether we are right, wrong, or just completely off our minds in terms of what we're presenting to you, at least hopefully it creates some kind of professional awareness, and that drives people to present, share, and take a stand and help drive forward the evolution of medical device security. So with that, we want to get into the program. And this is a 3-part series, and today obviously being the first part. Yes, you can get copies of the slides, and yes, we will have this recorded so you can access it later. But I wanted to at least briefly help you kind of understand what we're going to be covering. So in today's presentation, we're going to be focusing on comply. The next presentation on the 28th, we'll be focusing on how to detect threats and what you need to think about in terms of detecting threats against medical devices. And then in the last session together on the 11th, we will cover responding to medical device incidents. And so in each one of these, we're going to have a kind of a little slightly different focus, but ultimately to have a holistic medical device security program. And you'll hear me say that over and over again, is you need to get to a holistic program. And the programs we see today, if we audit somebody's program, if we're asked to come in and consult, they are not holistic. They're extremely fractured and typically ineffective. So hopefully the goal here is, regardless of the path you take, is to get to a very holistic medical device security program that you can definitively point to best practices related to compliance, detection, and response. And so we'll start today with comply and really spend a lot of time on best practices and things to kind of keep in mind there. A second piece of the program that is critical, and this is critical in terms of not just this program, but for us, everything we do when we work with clients, is ultimately how do we reduce liability and increase defensibility. Now, when I'm talking about defensibility in this context, I'm talking about legal defensibility. How do you defend yourselves in court? And this is a key component of your medical device security program. If you cannot point to or demonstrate how your program and your policies, procedures, strategies, your TTP, all of it together, your technology, does not reduce liability for your organization and also help you defend yourself in the event of a lawsuit, then you probably have fallen short. This is a critical aspect, regardless if you represent, the defense industry or defense healthcare, or if you're part of public or private healthcare. This is critical to do. And this is an area that is very uncharted for most cybersecurity professionals. We'll talk about why in a few moments, but it's important to understand that a lot of times when we hear people discuss these things, it's really misinformed. I've heard people come to me and say that, well, you don't want to violate HIPAA, you're going to go to jail, or a bunch of other things that are just way, way uninformed. And the sad part about it is we focus on things that we believe to be true and completely ignore the things that really could bite us. So hopefully going through this program, we'll be able to separate that fact from fiction and arm you with some tactics and techniques that you can use to assure that you not only have a holistic security program, cybersecurity program for medical devices, but that you also have the ability to reduce liability and increase your ability to legally defend the organization. So with that, I want to kind of establish a foundation in terms of some of the things that you need to start thinking about overall from your design of your medical device security program. And we're going to start in an area that probably is not typically where you would start from a cybersecurity program. Most people I know of that start a cybersecurity program, the first thing they're going to do is figure out what software they should deploy. Should we get intrusion detection, intrusion prevention? Should we do an asset fingerprinting? And that's not where you start. And that is probably the first mistake that we see people make, right, is go buy software. And we'll talk more about that momentarily. But we want to kind of take a step back and think about, what are we really ultimately trying to do here? So there are two noble truths that I'm going to share with you. And if you decide to kind of go to sleep or don't learn anything else in the entire program, these two noble truths are absolutely critical. If you want to measure the maturity of your cybersecurity program, these are the two things that you ultimately have to be thinking about or be able to achieve in order to break through and get a very mature, holistic program. The first one is that software alone is not a medical device cybersecurity program. I will tell you that most people we work with have come to this realization in one of two ways, either because they go through an audit or assessment of their maturity of their program with an organization like ours, and we kind of point out to them that they're missing a lot of pieces, and they're like, oh yeah, we never thought of all those things, or the other way that we find people kind of learn this lesson is a little bit of a harder way. They go out and they buy a bunch of software, they deploy it, it takes months, and then now suddenly they're realizing, like, wait, the software is just software. It doesn't do all this other stuff. Like, who's doing this? And a lot of times they may feel lost because they don't know what this is. They just know that the software is not enough. So the first noble truth, the first big thing here is all you've done is deployed software. It doesn't matter what vendor, whether it's our software or one of our competitors like Mitigate or Order or somebody else, it has nothing to do with the quality of the software, right? So this isn't a dig on software vendors. We are a software vendor, cybersecurity software vendor. This is simply that software alone is not a good strategy when we're talking about medical device security. So that's the first noble truth. The second noble truth is that cybersecurity best practices, frameworks, and regulations are designed to protect data, not humans. And this is extremely important. And we're going to dive into this a little bit deeper, but I want to kind of at least lay the groundwork for this right now. And that is that, simply stated, we need to realize that what we do as cybersecurity professional is the protection of data. And that is not applicable. Those practices, the things we do with that, are not applicable to protecting human life. Again, we're going to touch into that a little more, but I wanted to give you the first and second noble truths, and then we're really going to build everything today around those two noble truths. We're trying to address those two noble truths and assure that they don't exist in our collective environments when we're trying to establish medical device security programs. So let's talk a little bit more about this concept of we're designed to protect data, not humans. So as best as I know, and maybe I'm wrong and something's changed in the past 6 months, but don't think it has, every framework that we adopt, use, and deploy, and I don't really care what your preferred framework is, NIST 853, HITRUST, CSF, whatever you believe in, HIPAA, none of those are designed to protect human life from a cyber attack. Now, when we step back and we say medical device security, what do we really mean by that? Ultimately, what we mean in the most succinctest way possible is to assure that no cyber attack ever impacts patient safety or the ability to provide safe and effective patient care. Now, that may seem kind of obvious once we say it, but I think a lot of times just using the moniker medical device security ultimately keeps us arm's length distant from that definition, right? Well, we're protecting the devices. So we're all comfortable because ultimately we're all kind of like geeks and we're good and comfortable as long as it's blinking lights and it's got source code, right? But the reality is the device doesn't matter. And ultimately, device protection is secondary, completely secondary to assuring that there is no impact to patient safety. Now, when we change that definition, or when we realize and embrace that definition, I can tell you that, having presented this content before and spoken to a variety of people across the United States and actually in Europe, that suddenly people get very worried, right? Because suddenly you, as an IT security professional or privacy officer or whoever you may be that's attending today, suddenly your life is not about protecting the domain controller. It's not about how do you stop a DDoS attack. It's not about SQL injection. Those things are all secondary. Your primary focus in healthcare information technology and securing healthcare information technology is to start with the patient. And that's a very kind of scary place for all of us because we've never been trained, or a lot of us, or any of us have been trained on that, right? We didn't go to SANS Institute classes and realize, like, wait a minute, this is my focus, right? And there's an example that I use, especially when I'm interacting with board members and C-suite members. And that example is simply this. If in today's world, prior to this presentation, unless you've heard me speak in the past, or maybe you came to this realization on your own, but in today's world, right, as a security professional, our focus is on data. Now, the reality of life in a hospital is unfortunately, if a patient is impacted by a cyber attack, but the attacker never got to the data, they never did anything that creates a breach or a reportable event by HIPAA standards, we can actually consider that to be quite successful. We protected the data. We didn't breach. They didn't get to our records, but the patient's care could have been impacted. Now, if we change that, which is what really needs to happen, where we say, you know what, data protection is secondary to assuring that nothing occurs to that patient, our world suddenly gets turned upside down. But without this realization, you can't really have an effective medical device security program. And this is why this is the second noble truth, because once you realize this, and if you are able to accept it, then this first piece of the first noble truth, that software alone is not enough, suddenly becomes very realistic to you. It suddenly becomes very front and center. That in order to really protect patients, you can't just deploy software. Doesn't mean you don't need software. Doesn't mean you don't need all the cool fancy toys and gadgets, but you need to go well beyond that in order to protect patients. And that is the crux of this entire series, is really helping us all kind of get to that. So we're all pretty comfortable, as I just mentioned, with the devices, right? In fact, most of us as IT security professionals don't really ever leave the comfort of our IT domain, right? We do things remotely. We can get, in today's day world, we can even get to things from our home if we need to, right? We RDP, we VPN, whatever we're doing, right? But very few of us, actually get on the floor and come face to face with that which we're supposed to be protecting, which is the patient, right? And understanding the mechanics that that patient introduces to our security strategy is critical for success. So to give you a little teaser when we get to incident response, one of the big changes here that you're going to hear about as you go through this program is that ultimately we have to respond quickly and in a very professional manner whenever there's a patient impact at stake, right? Whenever patient safety is at stake. And we call this the critical success target. And this is a key differentiator between what I would call classical incident response, meaning we respond to protect data, right? Let's not let nothing happen to the domain controller. Let's protect our firewall, right? Which is important. But if we add in the context of a human life, right, we need to have a critical success target. We need to be tactical in our incident response. And to do that, we have to be able to respond, contain an attack, or prevent the further damage an attack can cause within 14 minutes or less. And again, we'll talk about that in the third part of this series, but I want to kind of help you understand that ultimately all of our policies, our practices, all of the technology that we do deploy, that software, all of it has to help us get to a position where when we need to respond, we're able to respond and contain or prevent a cyber attack against a human being in less than 14 minutes. Okay, and that's kind of what this shows. We'll revisit this on the third session and get really deep into what are the elements of a tactical incident response program and what you need to be thinking about in that. So right now, I want to kind of talk about the liability of incident response. So I've hopefully set the context and the stage for you as to what's at stake. And I'm 100% sure that all of us understand what was at stake before you ever came to this presentation. What I don't know is, has anybody really verbalized it, right? Has anybody actually stood up and said, hey, the emperor has no clothes, we're protecting data when we should be protecting patients? That I sometimes find people is the eye-opening piece. And so because of that, because we need to start with the patient, the next step in our equation is not what's the right software or what's the right policies and procedures. The next step in the equation is what's our legal exposure here? What do we need to put in place in order to protect ourselves? And this goes back to the early on the thesis I presented to you of we have to be able to reduce liability and increase legal defensibility. And I'm going to give you a few mechanics to help you kind of do that. And these are pretty powerful tools. We've had a lot of our clients use what I'm going to show you in the next 2 or 3 slides with their board of directors and make amazing inroads. But before we get into that, a couple of things. I am not an attorney, and Sensato is not a law firm, so I am not giving you legal advice. In fact, one of the things you probably need to do, and this is how these next few slides are used, is you need to go spend time with your legal representatives, right? Your chief legal officer, your CMO, your COO, CEO, right? Your board of directors and the compliance committee. And these next few slides are really meant for them. You need to know them, and you need to be able to understand how they impact your strategic decisions related to cybersecurity. But ultimately, it's going to be those individuals that make decisions related to the next slides. And there's no way out of it. There's no rock for them to hide under. They can't abdicate this. They can't say it's an IT issue, or this is the CIO's domain, or the CISO. This is their decision. The problem we have in the industry today is nobody's told them this is their decision, and nobody's educated them. What I do see sometimes is people get very frustrated. Oh, my board doesn't get it. My C-suite doesn't get it. But nobody's actually ever educated them or trained them. We just did a presentation a few weeks ago for about 56 different CFOs. And they all kind of came up to us afterwards and said, nobody's ever told us this stuff. I didn't know that was what we were supposed to be doing. So I'm giving you that because before you get frustrated or you say, hey, we've already, they just don't get it. You need to understand in this day and age, if you're doing medical device security, you have to educate the C-suite and the board. And don't give up on that fight, because you will not make complete progress in developing your security program if you don't do that. So what do we want to get them to understand? All right, first thing, you need to discuss the concept of patient-informed consent. What you see on the screen here is a blog post that was written actually about, I think, 3 years ago or something like that. So it's interesting to me, this is 3 years old and we're still talking about it and it's still relevant today. Now you can go read this. It's actually a pretty good article, and we can send you a link to it if you wish. It was posted on the FDA's website. And the premise of this article is that, do patients have a right to informed consent when it comes to not just medical devices, but your overall cybersecurity program? So let me get rid of the geek talk and put this in practical terms. You or somebody you love will rely upon a healthcare system, either the one you work in, or at some point in life, somewhere, you are going to need to go to the hospital. And it may be for the best reasons in the world, such as the birth of a new child, or it may be for some really scary, critical things that we hope never happen to any of us, but they will. When you go to that hospital, or your loved one goes to that hospital, if that hospital had a tremendous amount of Log4j vulnerabilities, if they had not applied patches to their VPNs, if their firewall was porous, if their medical devices were not isolated and could be impacted by a ransomware attack, and that could subsequently impact care, would you want to know? And the better question is, if you didn't know, if the hospital did not disclose that to you, would you feel that you had the right to sue if something negative came out of that lack of security or that lack of the ability for you to make an informed decision? This is basically what this article states. And it was, again, 3 years old. This has now become a very serious situation. Hospitals need to make a decision, especially when it comes to medical device security and the impact on patients, as to whether or not they're going to disclose potential security risks to the patient care. And we're going to go through something in a moment that illustrates this in spades, but you need to have this conversation. This is why, if you're going to build a cybersecurity strategy that is patient-centric and implies that you're going to safeguard medical devices, you can't just deploy software. You have to have these discussions. And for most people in the security side of the world, this is above our pay grade, but it has to still be decided, and it still has to be discussed. And this is a good example of something where, when we have had these discussions with CMOs and legal teams, they have said to us, like, we never ever thought of that before. And we've never really thought that an attack could actually be considered, or a vulnerability or a known threat to our environment should be disclosed to patients. So the second thing is, I want to talk about impact on patient mortality. And this is a critical piece of data that was actually published back in 2016-17 by Vanderbilt University. And this study, really what it showed was a significant cybersecurity event, attack, right? Incident, significant cybersecurity incident against a hospital actually negative or increases mortality. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this because we're going to come back to this when I talk about incident response in 2 sessions from now. And that is that, simply stated, if you have a significant cybersecurity event, you will have patients' safety impacted, and some of your patients will die because of that patient safety impact. And here's the cool part about that statement I just made. Most of us hate hearing the word patients die, right? And why is that cool? Because we've never talked about it before, and we need to start talking about that. We need to start realizing that there is actually definitive proof that was done by a study through a university hospital that shows any significant cybersecurity event leads to an increase in mortality. So let's talk about what do we mean by cybersecurity, in a significant cybersecurity incident, and why this occurs, because the reason it occurs is probably not something most people expect. A significant cybersecurity event is any event that disrupts hospital operations. Now, I want to clear that up a little bit because we can use words like operations and it sounds really professional, but yet it gets too far away from the reality of what we mean by that. What we mean when we say disrupt operations is anything that takes a caregiver's focus away from the patient. So that means if you have even a small attack, it can still interrupt operations, which leads to an interruption in patient care or the quality of care. So you don't need a full-blown cyber attack that takes out every device, right? Because that's what most of us would think is a disruption to security operations. It could be something that's localized to one unit. It could be something that just hits the cath lab, right? If I just take out your cath lab, right, is that going to impact hospital operations? Probably. Now, to understand how it interrupts it, that's the second piece of this. The piece that actually impacts patient safety is the psychology and the emotions of your clinical staff. And here's what happens. When there is a significant attack or a significant cybersecurity incident, what we see happen is the caregivers, the rest of the hospital organization, not the people in IT security and IT, they become concerned, right? Should I still be using this computer? Should I still be using that medical device? Is the device safe? What did they get to? Did they only get to patient data or did they get to financial data? Wait a minute, they got to financial data? Well, did they get to my employee information? Do they have my social security number? Is my financial information at risk? Do I have to need to change my bank account number? These are the conversations that occur even when you don't have a full-blown ransomware attack that's taken out everything in your hospital. But if you do have one of those, think about the increase in magnitude in terms of the emotional reaction by your care teams, your clinicians, and what that means to impacting your patient care. So we need to understand that when we're talking about being cybersecurity professionals in healthcare, our responsibilities go way beyond just what is the right software, right? We need to start thinking now about what is truly holistic incident response? How do we respond and prepare our teams so that if we do have a significant event and it does lead to some form of operational impact, it doesn't lead to an impact to patient care. Again, these are conversations that you need to illustrate and discuss with senior leadership because you can't do this alone. You can't bake all this and take care of it just as an IT security professional, but you do need to be aware of it and you do need to understand that what you're trying to protect ultimately can have impacts to patient care. It doesn't have to be a full-blown, Mr. Robot, completely go after somebody's pacemaker for us to think that patient care has been impacted. You just need some type of event that impacts operations. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Again, you can use this to open up discussions with your organization. So this lawsuit, which I'm assuming most of us know about, was the result of a ransomware attack, right? And what happened here was an attack took place in the hospital, and a woman who was in labor came to the hospital and was admitted and had her child. Her child was put onto fetal monitoring, and the fetal monitoring was unable to detect an abnormality in that child's heart rhythm. Now, the reason it couldn't detect the child's abnormality in the heart rhythm was because of the ransomware attack. The ransomware attack had hit before this person was actually admitted to the hospital. And so the problem we have here is informed consent, right? The hospital did not disclose to this patient before being admitted, before being put into a treatment or receiving therapy or care, that, hey, there's a ransomware attack going on. So, you just need to know that. Do you still want to come into our hospital? The mother stated later that if she would have known that, she would have chosen another hospital to have her child in. This is a very dramatic example of informed consent, but this is something that you need to be thinking about, right? If you fail to adequately protect a medical device, and the fetal monitoring system is a medical device, it is a 510K cleared device that was used in this case. And there was no defect in the device just got hit by ransomware. So at that point, you need to think about how should disclosure work, right? And so this illustrates it. Now, the second outcome of this case is that it has opened up the doors for attorneys to file similar lawsuits against other hospitals and to be on the lookout for situations where patient care has been impacted. So I'm presenting this to you in the previous slide, the Vanderbilt University study slide, so you can think about, okay, what do we need to do around informed patient consent? How is this going to work if we're going to do it, right? If we're going to actually tell patients that, hey, we do have these security risks, how is that workflow work? Who in IT security or clinical engineering or biomed is going to interact with leadership to let them know? Because this is a dynamic landscape, right? The security threats we have today are not the same security threats we're going to have 6 months from now or that we had 6 months ago. So how do we inform patients of potential risk, and what's the right and proper language? Again, these are things that you have to work through with your general counsel and others, but they are the cornerstones of your cybersecurity program, because you can't have adequate procedures and policies and practices if you haven't even figured out, okay, what's our consent and our disclosure going to be? So just some food for thought there. But this all starts with ultimately determining your risk tolerance, right? You need to understand what is the risk tolerance for your medical device security program, right? And this is not something that is decided by any CISO or CIO or IT security person or clinical engineering or biomed, depending on what you call it. Risk tolerance must be decided by the C-suite and the board of directors. And so, you can't push that down the road, or you can't push it down the chain of command, right? You can ask for input from people downstream of the top of the command chain, but ultimately the command chain, the top of the senior leadership, has to make the decision as to what is appropriate risk tolerance for this organization. Now, the reason for that is because there are economic factors that go into this. If you have higher risk, if you're going to accept higher risk, then you're going to spend less, and you're going to have to justify that. If you're going to have very low risk in your environment, you're going to have to spend more, and you're going to have to be able to assure you can make that level of spending occur. So these are financial, legal, and leadership decisions, but without defining your risk tolerance, you cannot design the rest of your cybersecurity program. It's very hard to do, right? And you'll understand what I mean by that in a moment. Some of you will say, well, of course I can. I don't have risk tolerance now, and I've got a really good security program. We'll talk about that in a moment. One mistake I will tell you not to make, and I see this at board levels and C-suites, and CIOs do this all the time, and some CISOs, is compare with other hospitals. I often get the question, John, we're a 300-bed hospital, or John, we're an 1,800-bed, 5-facility organization. What are other organizations our size doing? That is like the silliest question I've ever heard anybody ask. And I'll tell you, I say this to board of directors all the time. And I'm not trying to be cocky. It's just, do you really understand what you're doing in terms of negating any defensible position you have? So let's play a quick kind of game, right? Let's pretend you're in court and you've been sued. You are the organization that just got slapped with this civil lawsuit because you had a ransomware attack and you did not disclose the actual impact to the patient care, and you got sued. And you're in a courtroom, or whoever it is in your organization that would have to answer to this. You're going to be asked, how did you come up with your cybersecurity strategy? What was your cybersecurity budget? How did you come up to that? How did you decide your risk tolerance levels? What was acceptable risk tolerance for your organization? The answer to that is going to be, well, we looked at other hospitals that are our size within our geography and our level of specialty of care, and we determined that they spend that, so we decided that would be appropriate for us. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a really good answer, right? Like if we were watching Law and Order, we'd be like, okay, McCoy, you got a problem. That was a really good answer from that defendant. What are you going to do now? Well, if you have McCoy in the courtroom, probably what he's going to do is say, well, did you actually tour that other hospital you compared with? How many hospitals did you compare yourself with? 5. Did you go see those other hospitals? Are they running the same EMR? In fact, what EMR are you running? Are they running that EMR? What version of the EMR are they running? What's their patch levels? What's your patch levels? What IDS are they running? Are they running a SIM or are they not running a SIM? Do they have a SOC or do they not have a SOC? So hopefully you could start to see here that on the surface, comparing yourself to another hospital seems like a nice, clean way of figuring out what you should spend or do. But if you ever get put into the catbird seat and you have a really intelligent attorney, it's going to break down really fast. Because when you do comparisons like this, you don't ultimately have all the answers. So please don't do that. You have to do the work here. And it will end up in a better place for you in a much more defensible position. Okay. So we've talked about liability and defensibility. So how do we test for this? What's a simple test if we can decide that what decisions we're making when it comes to policy, process, and procedures related to medical devices actually are the right ones? Well, we developed something a while ago that we call the deposition test. And it's a really simple little game you can play. The deposition test is this. Imagine yourself from wherever you are. So if it's today, imagine yourself 18 months from now. So if you're deciding what is the right policy or whether you're going to do something or not do something related to medical device security, I want you to imagine yourself 18 months down the road sitting in front of an attorney in a deposition, right? And in a deposition, if you have never been through one or don't know what they are, you're not in court. It's just you, maybe your attorney, maybe not, but they can't do much for you, and the opposing counsel's attorney, and they're going to grill you. I mean, they're not supposed to, but they're going to grill you. And they're going to ask you all kinds of questions. What are those questions going to be related to? They're going to be related to the decisions you make today. So if you didn't put in the right policy, if your policies aren't up to date, if you don't have the right patch levels, if you haven't put into place the right incident response programs, those are all the things you're going to get asked about. So when you make decisions, and this can be applied to anything, if you're going to hire somebody and they don't have the right qualifications, how are you going to explain that 18 months from now if you get deposed, right? When we're dealing with people's lives, which is what we're doing with medical device security, the opportunity to be deposed is a lot higher than when we're talking about protecting data. And a lot of these concepts for most of us, because what we do is protect data day to day, are new, or they're kind of sort of, we've known about them, but the reality is most of us are never going to face an attorney because somebody deleted a bunch of records or exfiltrated 3,000 patient records, right? We're probably going to call LifeLock, get a bunch of people a bunch of subscriptions, patch stuff, recover, and move on. But when we impact patient life, right, or care, patient doesn't have to die, right? They just have to be impacted in some way. That's going to be a whole new game, right? People aren't going to just say, okay, just protect my credit score and we'll be okay. So the deposition test is a tool that you can use with your colleagues and your team to decide, is this something that 18 months from now we would be comfortable putting in front of an attorney and having them grill us on it? And if the answer to that is yes, like I have no problems with them asking me any question and I would be able to defend my decisions, then you know you're on the right spot. You know you've achieved legal defensibility. So the big things to understand is that you have to, when you're thinking about making these decisions, understand the impact on patient safety, understand economics, understand the lack of talent or lack of solution. These are the 4 things that typically you can use to justify not doing something, right, or doing something. So if you're going to put something in place, like, for example, we'll talk about this later, but medical grade networks, they create a potential challenge for many organizations. So they could impact patient safety. So you may be able to justify your decision by not doing something because it would impact patient safety. If you can point to that and it's valid, you've got a defensible position. If economics preclude you from doing something, you have a defensible position. but it has to be real, right? Like, and this is where you need your CFO. You can't just say you can't afford something, and meanwhile everybody on the C-suite's driving Porsches and gotten really big bonuses. That would be a problem, right? Lack of talent. You may be in a geography where you don't have the talent or access to the talent that you need in order to carry out the strategy and the policies and practices you need. And the next one may be lack of solution. You may not have the technology or the systems available to you that you need in order to protect the environment in the way that you would want to. Those are kind of the four things that if you had to stand in front of an attorney and explain why you didn't do something, these are the four reasons that typically will stand up. So that you can use these on your own, right? If you're trying to make a decision today, you can decide that, hey, one of these four fits and we really can't do this. We know we should, but we really can't because it's one of these four reasons. If none of these four reasons apply to your decision, then you probably sort of should have figured out a way to make it happen, because you're going to have a very hard defensible position if you ever go to court. All right, so all of that stuff I just gave you is the backdrop to developing effective policies and practices. So I'm going to speed things up a little bit, but I wanted to have that foundation because everything we talk about the rest of this program today, next session, and the session after that will all come back to those things we just talked about: the first and second noble truth, the focus on data versus patients, legal liability and defensibility. All of those things will come into play. All right, so ultimately what you're trying to do is balance these three things, right? You really want to make sure that your policy, and we're just going to talk about policies and practices in this session. We'll talk about detection, like I said, in the next session. But your policies and practice have to address compliance, detection, and incident response, right? Ultimately. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through some ideas of things that you should be thinking about when you're developing your incident, your policies and practices. So there's a bunch of stuff that you need to think about. How well do your medical device security policies integrate with your IT security policies, right? How do you create a common operating picture? This is critical. We have seen a lot of situations lately where people buy software and clinical engineering runs it. When I talk about software, I mean security software or medical device security software, and it's run by clinical engineering, and IT security's got really nothing to do with it. And there's like this separation of church and state. You don't want that. You really need a holistic view of both IT and your IoT and medical device security platforms. Very critical to do. Right, we're going to talk about some of these things, like what happens if there's an incident, what happens after it's deployed. We're going to talk about all that, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. One resource you can use is there is a medical device cybersecurity regional incident preparedness and response playbook. It's a good read. I believe it's been updated. So you can get that from the FDA site. Just Google medical device security or medical device cybersecurity regional incident preparedness, and it should come up with a link for you. But it is good going. It's not really deep, but it is a good resource. It actually was developed originally by MITRE, FDA, and based on a lot of the work we did on incident response and preparedness. Okay, so your security policy. Now, before I get into this deeper, I do get the question sometimes as to, well, John, we already have IT security policies. Okay, if you ask me that, I'm going to point out that you missed the part on me saying we protect data traditionally. Your IT security policies and practices are focused on protecting data. So if you really want to go to court and pull out your IT security policies and practices and bring them into a courtroom and have me kind of look at them and go, wow, this is awesome. You've encrypted your data. How does that help you protect human life? That's the bottom line, right? You have to make sure that your medical device cybersecurity policies and practices are specific to medical device cybersecurity and ultimately protecting the patient. That doesn't mean that what you have in your IT security policies may not be applicable, but you really need to go through them and either evolve them or decide that you're going to have a second set of policies specific to medical device security. I don't know if there's a best practice one way or the other. I am warning you not to just think we already have IT security policies, so we're good. Because again, we protect data, not patients. So you're probably missing a lot of stuff there. There are three components typically to any security policy, but obviously with medical device security, we want to make sure that your medical device security policies support risk management, operational management, and security operations. These three things have to be in the medical device security policy at some level. And when we dive into this, what we see is from a medical device risk management, we're talking about acquisition and purchase, disclosure monitoring, and vulnerability monitoring. I'm going to touch on each one of these briefly, just to give you some orientation. On operational management, we're going to talk about things like qualification and training and tracking. So we'll talk about that, and then monitoring and response in terms of security operations. Now, again, we're talking about written policy here. This is not actually the solution, right? This is just, you got to think about this. You're going to get deposed. Somebody is going to subpoena your policies, right? And if your answer to that is, well, we don't have medical device security policies, we kind of just do everything ad hoc, you're already starting in a bad place. So you need to get these policies written, deployed, figured out. It doesn't have to be overnight. It could be over the next 18 months, but you got to start down that path. Okay, so acquisition and purchase, some things to think about. Your policies have to address things like vendor disclosure, right? How that's going to be dealt with, and how often you are monitoring vendor disclosures. You have to have a risk assessment framework for medical devices. You can't just have the cardiologist decide to go talk to a third-party vendor and turn on a device and bring it on your network. You have to get everybody plugged into the fact like, hey, we need a process here. And any device that comes in, a medical device, has to be assessed. And that assessment should be between IT security, and your clinical engineering teams. That's got to be spelled out. Right? Medical device vulnerability scanning. How often are you doing that? Right? And how are you doing that? Because a scan in and of itself could cause a patient safety issue. So you need to really think through how you're dealing with that and coordinating those scans. Remediation management. What is the level of security remediation, right? How are you going to do it? How are you going to remediate? What's the tactics related to remediation? And you have to allow an authority to reject. This is critical. And some of you are going to say, that'll never happen here. I don't know what to tell you. I'm happy to come talk to your boards. You have to empower your IT security and clinical engineering teams to say, no, that device is too risky to bring in. Why? Because the worst thing you could have is a legal situation where you guys get deposed and you say, yeah, we knew we shouldn't have brought it in, but the cardiologist overrode us. Can't have that. And so you have to have authority to reject in these policies. If you don't, here's what I do. I send an email to people and say, that's fine if you don't want to give us the authority to reject, but just be aware of the fact that without our ability to reject, we may have a security issue that's brought into the organization and could potentially impact patient safety. I just want to make you aware of it. Have a nice day. Typically that helps fix things. Disclosure monitoring, we've kind of talked about this, but you have to, as part of your threat intelligence program, you need to be embedding or integrating medical device security threats as part of that. Vulnerability management. We talked about scans, but one thing to think about is that how you have to figure out the criticality of vulnerabilities and the response time to them. So typically, in most organizations, when you're doing patch management, if you have a critical or high risk patch, you may patch it, but there's no clock ticking, and some of you may have that. With medical devices, you have to have a clock ticking, right? You want to be in a position where you say, look, if there is a critical update that we have to perform, we have to perform it in X amount of time, and we have to track it over every XY amount of time. Hopefully that makes sense. The point is, you can't just have the same patch management you do for network devices as for medical devices. And I'm not talking about who does the patching or who does the updates. That usually is clinical engineering. But you need to be able to have some structure that says, if you have a security issue or a security patch and it's a high or a critical, it has to be applied to medical devices in X amount of time, right? You want to show that discipline. Operational management. This is a big one, right? One of the things that we see a lot with clinical engineering and biomed when we talk to them is they will tell us, kind of like when we're grabbing lunch with them, and they'll say, look, I don't have an IT background, or I kind of studied IT in college, but that was 20 years ago or 15 or 10 years ago. We don't do what IT does. So I'm not really even sure what the security stuff is. The point of that is you have to figure out what is the minimum level of security experience somebody in clinical engineering has to have in order to support your medical device security program. Secondly, what kind of ongoing qualifications do they need as the world evolves? How are you embedding and integrating your clinical engineering team with IT security so that they have a view of overall threat challenges and risk management? They need to be able to identify threats. They should be able to perform scans. They have to be able to evolve their practices and capabilities, and they have to be able to interpret the indicators of compromise. Right? The clinical engineering biomed, from a security perspective, need to be able to raise the alarm and say, hey, we've got a big issue, and we've got to disclose this to patients from a security perspective. And that sometimes is lost, right? That process isn't there always. Training. Security, we're going to talk more about training as we go through the program, but security awareness training is critical. And so a lot of organizations are doing ongoing security awareness training with phishing and, don't click on this thing. And, if you see a ransomware attack, stop, drop, and roll, those kind of things. And that's all great. And you need to keep doing that. But unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because you probably have a lot of stuff on your plate already, you need to figure out how to carve out time to explain to clinicians that are working with medical devices how to spot security anomalies, how to report them, how to evaluate and do triage. What is the protocol for if they see something related to security and there's a patient? What is that protocol? What is that triage? And this is, again, for your end users. This is not your training that we call specialized training, which would be given to clinical engineering and biomed. And this is more of tactical incident response, basic IT training, doing simulations with them. So you've got to think about your training and your policies related to training divided into two things: your clinical end users and then your operational units, right? Your IT and clinical engineering teams. Anomaly tracking, and this is something typically is being done already by clinical engineering. So you typically can just augment your policy with whatever they're doing. They're going to track whatever anomalies are there. Right, but you need this in case, in the event, you have to demonstrate that you did spot this and this is the action and mitigation you took. Network segmentation is the big one. I know it's hard for a lot of people, but you really should have your medical devices segmented as best as possible, or be moving towards a zero trust network or something of that nature. But you need to think about what is your policy when it comes to medical device security. And again, this is one that's hard to hide from because it's considered a best practice. Your policy needs to call out what is it that it's going to be done, and you could have an economic challenge. So you need to think about, are you going to do this or not? We talked about patch management in terms of, having criticalities. One thing I will say on patch management, I hear this a lot. Well, we can't apply the patch because the vendor's telling us if we do, we'll be violating 510K. There are a lot of myths. If you need to apply a patch, because it will positively impact patient care, meaning by not having this security risk, it minimizes the chances of patient care being disrupted, you can apply that patch. There's an entire presentation the FDA has done on all the myths related to patching. So I urge you to go look at that because you can patch more than you think. Ultimately, if a vendor ever tells you, medical device manufacturer, just to be specific, that you can't apply that because you avoid the warranty and you think there's a patient safety issue, you need to get your legal counsel to send that medical device manufacturer a letter advising them and putting them on notice that their device is potentially causing a patient safety issue. And that becomes a reportable event to FDA, which you should do. And I can guarantee you that you will get a very strong and positive response from that medical device manufacturer. But you can't just let it go. You can't just say, oh, okay, well, we're not going to do anything and not document it and take additional action. And that action may be up to and include not using that device, which I know for some of you, that could be your cath lab. And that's a big revenue hit. But you got to make that decision, right? You can't just let it happen, right? Okay. Remote support, a lot of the stuff that's out there for medical devices, there is a lot of remote support going on. We've had many incidents where we thought there was an attack going on in the network, and it turns out to be a medical device manufacturer using some kind of third-party remote support software that looks suspicious. So your policies should have language related to how remote support will be done for medical devices. You may already have that in your IT security policies, then you can use that, but make sure it's specific to medical devices. Monitoring and response, this is big, right? This is where you really need to have policies related to how you will monitor medical devices, what will be the incident response criteria, what will be the level of incident response training. All of those things need to be spelled out in the policy. So a couple things to know. We're not going to cover all these right now. I'm just going to use them as kind of a notepad for me. We've talked a lot about this, end of life. If you have medical devices that are end of life, running end of life operating systems or rely on them, you have to have a plan. You can't just recognize like we got 10 2008 Windows servers running telemetry. You have to say we have them, we recognize them, here's the garden, the walled garden we put in place, and we have a plan to get rid of them over the next 18 months or 24 months. You have to have something. You don't want to go into a courtroom and say, well, yeah, we knew we had them. What'd you do about them? I told management, but they didn't want to do anything. That's not good. You have to have a plan, right? Doesn't mean you have to get rid of them overnight, but you have to have some kind of plan. Your cybersecurity, you should have a medical device cybersecurity team. For that team to be effective, you will need, obviously, clinical engineering. You must have nursing involved, probably your CNO. You should have a CMO or other physicians, IT and IT security, obviously, compliance and legal. Some other groups that are helpful is nursing education, right? One of the things you can do to push out security awareness training is use your learning management system. And help record who has had medical device security awareness training, right? And that can be done through your nursing education group. So you need to have kind of what we see usually happen is on a quarterly basis, these people come together and they review policy and challenges and risks. And on a monthly basis, you have a smaller team, usually just IT security and clinical engineering, who get together on a monthly basis to review what's going on, where they at in terms of patching, vulnerabilities, threats, things of that nature. And then you have an emergency response team, which is usually going to be your clinical engineering team, and we'll talk about that in the third session. And this governance and management is what I just described: quarterly meetings for the broader group, monthly meetings for the smaller groups, and managing that capability. We're gonna talk about some of this stuff in detection, but 24/7 monitoring. This is a big one we see. Somebody will buy software and they'll deploy it, and then they'll realize like, well, nobody's monitoring alerts at 3 a.m. You want to talk about a non-defensible position from a legal perspective, that's a good one, right? You knew you were supposed to buy software, you deployed it, it's monitoring your medical device security environment or your medical device networks, and suddenly an alert goes off at 3 in the morning, but the clinical engineering team doesn't come in until 9 because they're not there 24/7, and you've had a security threat for basically, I guess, what, 3 or 4 or 5 hours. That's not good, right? You knew you had issues or could have issues, but you did nothing to mitigate. So if you deploy anything to protect your medical device security, you should be deploying some form of a SOC. And that SOC should be trained in how to protect human life. So just something to know. Yeah, we're going to talk about all this stuff with response. This really important. We'll talk about more in detect. If you have medical device security networks, medical device grade security networks, you need to think about that from a policy perspective, how you're going to protect them. A lot of times, manufacturers like GE, Siemens, Philips, and others will not allow you to deploy anything to these third-party networks. And so how do you protect them? How do you secure them? We'll talk to you about that in the detection side of the equation when we get into the next session. But in a policy side, you need to address how are you protecting and managing medical device grade networks. Your medical device networks are your most critical, obviously, right? These are the ones that are, supporting your ICU, your operating theaters, your CCU, your PACU. These are critical networks. And if an attacker got to them, security anomalies got to them, that could be a real bad day for your environment. So just to wrap up things, we are here for you. I know we've dropped a lot on you. I'm hoping this is helpful. Just so you know, we do have, like I mentioned, a variety of different services that we're happy to bring to bear for you. We have also a document that you can email info@sensato.co. It's, I think, 30, 40 pages. It kind of goes through everything we just talked about and much more. So it's meant for you to use as a resource with this program so that you can kind of have a place to turn to. It's got a I think it's even got a project plan we put in there, a template for a project plan. So it's got a lot of things in there that we just don't have the time to go through as part of this program, but it's a great resource. So I encourage you to reach out to us and we'll send you a copy of it. We do have a full medical device security program, which includes templates of all the policies we've just discussed. The 24/7 monitoring by Security Operations Center. We've got our own software platform that does all the stuff we'll talk about next week. We also fully integrate with others like Medigate and now Palo Alto and others. We also can supplement SOC. So if you already have a SOC, we work in the capacity of being that tier 2 SOC, where if your SOC gets a medical device security issue, they can escalate to our SOC and we can take over that piece of the response equation. So just so you know, those things are there for you. I know we kind of ran a little bit over on time. I appreciate you being here. Please drop us an email. Let us know, like, hey, man, that was great, or hey, that really sucked. It helps us shape, right? We want these to be great for you. So anything less than that, let us know. We'll do what we can to evolve the content. I really hope to get to meet some of you at some point, but you know, hoping this was at least got you thinking. And again, if you have questions, please reach out. So thank you so very much.